Hi, afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're really excited to have everyone here with us this afternoon. I'm Jennifer Kidd, and I'm one of the AJOG MFM editorial fellows. I'm here with my co-fellow, Matthew Jansen. And then we also have one of the editors for AJOG MFM, Terry Ann Bennett, with us today. I just want to arc back to where we were last time we had an episode, and we had met with Dr. Bergella. We had gone through kind of how editors interact with reviewers and the reviewing process. And today we're actually going to have Dr. Bennett, who is another one of the editors for the AJOG MFM, give us a lot more detail about equity, diversity, and inclusion and what that means for both readers and reviewers, as well as editors in the medical publishing process. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. And like you said, I think we're really excited to have Dr. Bennett with us today and go through things. So I guess to really just jump right in, Dr. Bennett, how would you, kind of define, what equity, diversity, inclusion means from this academic publishing standpoint? And are there kind of distinct aspects to your role as an editor focusing in this area, or how has that been with AJOG MFM?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you both for inviting me to join these conversations. I'm excited to sort of bring forth these special and very important topics surrounding equity, diversity, and inclusion. As we all know, after the murder of George Floyd, there was a racial reckoning here in the United States across the board in every field, and especially journals really started to look at what role were we playing in the dissemination of information that was not centered in equity, and what can we do to sort of change that landscape? And so AJOG MFM definitely ensured that the journal was moving in that direction, and how my role became available. And as I created my title, I wanted to lead with equity. And so that's why my title is designed around equity being first, but definitely with the focus of diversity and inclusion. And so as the EDI, the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion editor of AJOG MFM, I'm extremely proud and very excited to be working with such an amazing cohort of editors and even more amazing reviewers, which we really lean on heavily. But even though my role is centered sort of on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and many of the manuscripts that I review are also centered on those topics, it's not the focus of how we work as an editorial board. So we meet regularly, we all hold equal positioning, and we exchange information across the board. So though my focus is EDI, it is our focus as an entire board that we're having an equity lens as we review all manuscripts that are submitted to AJOG MFM.
That's great to hear, and we're so excited that AJOG MFM has recognized this need and given you the ability to express it and move this topic forward. We are going to go through just some questions we have about reading and reviewing papers from our perspective that hopefully you can give us some insight into. So the first one we wanted to discuss was about the role of the demographics table, typically what is called Table 1 in most manuscripts. And what does that mean for publication? Is this something that's framing for our readers and reviewers the equity and diversity of patients that are included?
Yeah, I love that question because I really do think that that is a prime example of an area that we can improve, that we can bring to the next level in regards to how we're thinking about equity from the design of a study to the publication of a manuscript. Here at AJOG MFM, we're in support and in concordance with the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine special statements, specifically in regard to race in maternal fetal medicine research and definitely around gender diversity. And we want to make sure that there's accuracy in the information that's being published, but also that we're sort of taking an anti-racist approach at how we're looking at the language and terminologies and characterization that we use. We all know traditionally sort of how we denoted race and ethnicity was really a little bit questionable. Were we allowing people to self-report and self-identify, which is what we should do? But now that I think in a sort of more national landscape, we've really all accepted that race, ethnicity are all social constructs with no biological sort of backing behind them. I think we've gotten to the point where we can move away from sort of these standardizations and using these big boxes to denote people into categories of race and ethnicity. And I think that's why Table 1, the demographic table, is so very important, because it's given us an opportunity to stop and think about what we have done in the past and how those things may not actually be anti-racist or leaning in or leading with equity, and really reevaluate how we're allowing people to self-report. So the traditional categories of race and ethnicity are very, very big boxes and broad. They're so inclusive that maybe they aren't really doing what we intend for them to do. In general, the goal is to be able to pick up sort of risk factors or be able to use race as a proxy for other things like racism and bias. But the reality is, in the way that we really look at race and ethnicity in our country and how we're sort of minimizing or limiting how people can identify, may also be problematic. So one of our goals, and what we hope, especially as we are just about to put forth our new author instructions at AJOG MFM, is to really ensure that we are stepping outside of our comfort zone and we're eliminating those barriers for how people identify. And we're recognizing that within each of these large race categories, white, Black, Asian, ethnicities of Hispanic, non-Hispanic, et cetera, are actually not always as descriptive as we entail. For example, Hispanic ethnicity as a category may not be very informative for the differences within the Hispanic ethnicity, and especially as we look at Hispanic Black versus non-Hispanic white identifying people. And even in the other race category, which is something that we commonly see in our Table 1s, sometimes can be problematic when we lump people into this group that's so all-inclusive that it really doesn't allow us to study different cohorts of people who identify with races or ethnicities that we may not actually have a large cohort within our own patient populations or our own sort of resources that we use to go back on to reevaluate sort of how people are identifying. So I think it puts us at a crossroads as we're designing studies of the future to really be critical in how we're allowing people to identify, so that we can really hone in on what are these categories, what do they mean, how are we using them and when we're talking and discussing and evaluating our patients, and what do they mean when we're identifying associations within those groups.
Wow, that's a lot, and to unpack just mentally, but that's really exciting that we're kind of moving back away from this kind of boxed society, but really kind of digging into the details and kind of better seeing the diversity of patients that we see, and that AJOG MFM is really open to kind of pushing the envelope in that way. Related to that, we also had a question about, also in Table 1, not just race and ethnicity, but oftentimes insurance information is provided. And we sometimes associate that as a proxy that kind of gives us an idea about socioeconomic status of our patients. Do you have any comments on whether that's really giving us that information?
Oh, absolutely. One thing that I would encourage writers to do is to maybe be a little bit more bold and to think about, when we're using these different categories, when we're asking about race, when we're trying to ascertain one's socioeconomic status and using these quote unquote proxies, why can't we just actually ask those specific questions when we're designing our study? So why do we have to use sort of these, what one of my students referred to as a lazy proxy, to identify the true issue of what we're trying to get it to? So let's get to the meat of the matter when we're designing our studies in the first place, because we're really at a point now where I think we can all say we recognize that disparities exist. We recognize that there are inequities in race categories and ethnicity groups. We recognize that socioeconomic status, though obviously not the complete answer for disparities within our field, especially, we know these things. So a lot of manuscripts now, what we're hoping for the future is that we're going to move beyond these descriptors, which is a lot of what our Table 1, our demographic table is, and really looking at sort of moving beyond sort of describing and looking for solutions. And I think the way how we're going to get to that is if we move beyond these proxies and really get to the meat of the matter. So certainly a lot of our databases are going to have this data, and that's all we have. And so we're trying to derive as best as we can, what does this mean and how do we use this data? But as we're moving forward, we need to really just hone in and obtain the appropriate data to make the right association so we can create and implement the right interventions.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that advancement because I think that's what we want to know. We want to give our patients the best care, and really getting that information is what we need to do.
And I think a lot of this sounds like it is dealing with really education and about, educating, those people that are publishing these studies and designing these studies of the future, as you said, to move beyond those descriptors. And so I guess I wonder, it sounds like the author guidelines and new author instructions are coming out that will address some of this, but how else, I guess, do you see your role as an editor in educating both the reviewers that are going to be looking over, many of these, studies, and those that are writing them and publishing them?
I love that question, because one of the things that I live by and my motto, and what we are also sort of trying to push forth as an editorial board, is to elevate the collective consciousness. And that's of ourselves as an editorial board. That's for our authors and other reviewers and other editors that we work with, and also for all practitioners of obstetrics. And that's what we really hold true as one of our core principles, is not. I've heard an echo. Are you all hearing that echo?
Matt, maybe just mute and see if it's correct.
Okay, I think it's gone. So one of the things that we definitely want to do as an editorial board is sort of elevate the collective consciousness of our readership, our authorship, our reviewers, our editors, and ultimately practitioners of obstetrics, because that's really what we want to do, right? We want to change the world. We want to change how we practice. We want to eliminate these health disparities. And we really think how we're going to do that is through evidence, is through the manuscripts that are coming through our journal. And so we're going about that by sort of how we communicate with our reviewers, how we communicate with the people who are submitting manuscripts to our journal. And really, once a manuscript comes through, that's an excellent opportunity for us to really exchange information that we think is pivotal to make a manuscript powerful. And so a lot of what we do with our reviewers and with the comments that we send back as editors is to elevate that paper. EDI and DEI, how people usually refer to it, is a very hot topic, right? A lot of people are publishing in this category. Everyone sort of wants to do something about these disparities that are quite alarming. And I think we all mean well as a society and as individuals. But what we really sort of need to hone in on is how to be better individuals, how to be better doctors, how to be better writers, how to be better at the type of papers that we're publishing. So from our standpoint, a lot of what we do when we're feeding back from a manuscript is sometimes we may link to an article that may be informative in how this language is being used in this paper. We may link back to the NIH and sort of the push towards using person first language when we're talking about someone, how to really differentiate when we're using nouns versus adjectives. For instance, instead of saying this woman, this is an obese woman, to say this is a person or this is a woman with obesity, and really leaning in on making people much more than their diagnoses and honing in on that person first language to really be empowering. And some of that, I think, feedback that we provide and how we're changing language is ultimately going to lead to more thoughtfulness and more provocative writing from our submissions. And ultimately, we think will seam its way into how we're practicing and how we're interacting with our patients day to day.
Much, and I hope that was my. I think reviews.
Sorry, we're having some difficulty understanding you, Matt. There's like a lag in your.
For the technical difficulty.
Why don't I ask the next question while you go ahead and see if your sound corrects, Matt? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Because it's giving a lot of feedback. All right. So Matt's going to work on that. I'll continue forward, but this is such a great discussion that you're having with us, Dr. Bennett. So I think, you kind of touched on this a little bit about giving feedback to the reviewers and also to the authors about, just the dialogue that they could be having and should be having in publications. And you touched a little bit also on language use. So do you think there should be a discussion where we're standardizing the language that we're using with EDI, or is this something that maybe should be individualized and that we're still really trying to figure this out at this point, that there needs to be some diversity even in how we're discussing this?
Absolutely. I think it's a both and approach, to be quite honest. I definitely think that there needs to be some leverage and some autonomy with our authors to be able to speak authentically about their work. And I think there's power in authenticity. So certainly I do think that there's a limit to how much we standardize things. But I do think we're at a point now where we are learning, and language is an evolving element. And as the times change, what was okay to say yesterday may not be okay to say today. So I think understanding that language is ever evolving and changing with the times and what's acceptable for society in that generation and in that time period, we have to be flexible and we have to be thoughtful about what that language means, who that may be offensive to, and making sure that we are constantly reevaluating and reassessing that. Similarly to how we should be constantly reevaluating and reassessing our own biases, and how every day we should be constantly reassessing how to be anti-racist in our thought, in our writing, in our publications, in our actions. And I think language is the same. So though I think there are room to sort of help guide to ensure that we are sort of on a similar understanding of what we mean when we say X, and helping people to be on the same page in regards to what's offensive now, I do think that we have to also be flexible to understand that that may change, and to be able to move with the landscape and move with the times.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think we have to be humble in some way and say, we don't know all of the answers right now, and we are going to try and address it as best we can. But I think having some ability to morph or change the language surrounding this topic is super important. And I think, the journal being open to variety and language that's used is going to be helpful to kind of move this field forward so that we can better understand what is going on.
Absolutely.
Related to that, as a reviewer, I think, Matt, you're back with us?
Yes, I'm back with you. Despite all of these years of virtual meetings, these technical difficulties still happen to me, apparently.
Not a problem.
No problem.
So we were just discussing that, in the reviewing process, we as reviewers are aware that there are statistical reviews that can be called for in papers because of how the reviewer feels that the manuscript has been published, or received. So we were kind of discussing, should there be something similar for EDI? Is that something that maybe this should be routed to different reviewers or editors, or is this something that should be more standardized in some way?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So when I hear that, two things immediately come to mind. One, at AJOG MFM, we're very collaborative. So as a cohort of editors, we are constantly and feel free to reach out to one another. We all have our own special interests and our expertise, and we lean on one another when available. And I think that that's a beautiful part of working for this group, is that we're always making each other better. With that said, certainly any editor can reach out to their EDI or DEI editor for guidance, because we're human, right? And we're not perfect. And there's not always a right answer to how to say and or do certain things. So I think definitely sometimes having another opinion or having another lens look at something can improve sort of that review, and to make sure that we're publishing data that's comprehensive, that's provocative, but also that's accurate and stimulating and leaning with that equity lens. But with that said, we really don't want to be a journal where only the EDI editor can look at equity papers, or only the EDI editor has the expertise to be able to ensure that we're publishing data that has an equity lens. So we not only hope to elevate the collective consciousness of our authors and our readers, but also ourselves. And we want to ensure that all of the papers that are coming through our journal has an equity lens. And so that's a part of our goal when we meet as a cohort and when we learn from one another.
And it sounds like certainly there's, been a lot of focus in how to do that within AJOG MFM. And it seems like one of those things, as you alluded to, is, that these new author guidelines are coming out. And I'm sure that's just one portion of many things. But is there anything as like I'm trying to work on manuscripts, and Jen is, and everyone is too, is there anything specifically that's like a sneak peek of those guidelines that you were really excited about to go in, or just excited about to have, that you think will be helpful to people?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things I actually dropped earlier in the talk as a sneak peek is looking at sort of like the diversity of language and honing into some of our national standards. And so one of the links that we are going to put in our upcoming author instructions is sort of linking to some of that examples of first person language and examples of sort of how to think about different race categories. And some of that is derived from the NIH, which I think has some great documents about sort of how to critically think, some way standardized, but also be open in how we're sort of characterizing people by race and looking at all the different things that fit into those big boxes that are traditional. So that's one of the sneak peeks for sure. I think one thing that I really want to hone in on is really also focusing on sort of in general how to use destigmatizing language. And so one thing that we do as AJOG MFM cohort is we bring forth issues or things that we're coming across in our regular meetings. So we're having discussions, we're exchanging information, we're coming up with a consensus because we all share sort of that similar sentiment of just wanting to be leaders in that space, and also just wanting to ensure that the manuscripts that we put forth in our journal is saying the right thing and representing what we want to represent as a journal and our ideals around that. And so that's one of the sneak peek areas, is just sort of linking to other resources that we think are really great, honing in on sort of destigmatizing language and really being focused on sort of how to talk about race. I think race and racism are loaded words, and they're very hot topics, and they sometimes make people feel uncomfortable. And that's okay. And I think that's good, actually. If we're not feeling uncomfortable or stopping to think about what we're saying, doing, and or writing, then we're not evolving, and we're not getting better, and we're not pushing ourselves as human beings. So I think we should be feeling uncomfortable all the time, every day. You should feel a little discomfort so you can grow, so you can expand. And so one of the things that we, in that regard, that we're really honing in on are some of the common things that we've come across in our most recent submissions that really help to guide people on what should I say? I want to say the right things. I want to use the right words. I don't want to be offensive. I want my language to be powerful and empowering. And so
Yes, I got kicked out, I think. I don't know if that happened to everybody else, but
Yes.
okay.
We're just having all the technical difficulties today. We apologize.
I understand. Sometimes it happens.
But
just to sort of circle back with what we were concluding with, one of the sneak peeks that's coming out with the author instructions is sort of a guidance that really helps people with what language should I use? Because I think people have great intentions. People don't want to be offensive. People don't want to use stigmatizing language. A lot of people are writing about topics that are involved diversity and equity, and they want to use the right language to have a paper that's powerful, but also empowering. So that's some of the things that we honed in on this next iteration of the author instructions, is providing those examples, because we know people are asking themselves sometimes, well, what's the right way to say this? Or how should I address this? And so a lot of what we're doing in sort of the next iteration is giving those examples of how to say X. What are some examples of what you can use for different race categories? What are some words that you shouldn't use that may come off as stigmatizing, so that people can really have a language that's also centered in equity?
yeah, I think that'll be so helpful because, I know as both, a reviewer and as a writer, sometimes if I just look up other examples or I find other articles, they're not always done in the best way. And so I think it'll be so nice to have, this clear outline and clear links to other examples, as you mentioned too, that I know, have kind of done this in an exemplary way to continue to follow and to build. So I think that's great. And I guess the next part of the question is, how do we, or how do you, I guess, at AJOG MFM kind of encourage, not only the diversity of submissions, but, the kind of a diversity of reviewers and everybody to be looking at all of these things too?
I think that's a really outstanding question. And it's also like a super hot topic, because similarly to sort of the earlier question that was inquiring about, well, are you the one doing all the diversity papers, or like, how does that all work? We also want to ensure that our reviewers similarly have that elevation in consciousness and are able to sort of review with an equity lens. And in that avail, what we do is we're always looking for reviewers. So just a plug, anybody wants to sort of work in that space or review some articles, we're always open. But I think one thing that we do at AJOG MFM that I'm sure other journals do as well is we're constantly adding in new reviewers. And sometimes I include reviewers that may not even be a maternal fetal medicine specialist or even work in our field, because that diversity of thought is expansive and it can mean a lot of things. And I think that we not only want to make sure that we're sort of fitting into our little box, but that we're also having sort of a thought that is expansive beyond our subspecialty. So I've added in reviewers that actually don't even have an MD behind their name to review some of our papers, because I think that that's extremely imperative. And diversity in thought is really one of the key elements of true diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, we could agree more. I think that, one of the things that I think you already answered that we were curious about too was, encouraging that diversity of thought from other fields, which you mentioned, and also just from different types of practices. I think, obviously as still in training, we're at larger academic centers, and how do we, get places from, or get people from other sorts of institutions that are doing a lot of great work involved in the reviewing and in the submissions too. So I think that that's, wonderful. And
Yeah,
Jen,
I think Dr. Bennett, when you and I had talked about this topic a little bit more, you also mentioned that there is some interest in trying just including diversity, not just of race, but also of location of publication, that there may be areas with low resource or non-academic, or even we talked about a little bit about location of where people are physically in the country, maybe contributing to some lack of diversity that we're seeing in publication. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up, Jennifer. So certainly, like we said, diversity is a very big box and can mean many things. And I think commonly we think about that in regards to race, ethnicity, sex, gender, etc. But we also at AJOG MFM want to ensure that our publications are expansive and generalizable. And with that said, we're encouraging for people in community hospitals, in non-academic centers, and in all sectors across the United States, not so much inclusive of only just the Northeast and the West Coast, but also Middle America, the South, et cetera, because that's how we're truly going to be generalizable. And also maybe we'll learn something new that we haven't seen in our traditional cohorts of studies that are typically published. And I think a lot of sort of cohorts have come together to try to accomplish that. MFMU and other study groups who have tried to be multidisciplinary and have also tried to be multi-practice and multi-institution. But I definitely think sometimes we miss out on sort of those smaller community hospitals that certainly we can gain a lot of knowledge from. And so we are definitely encouraging for institutions across the board to collaborate with smaller institutions, with non-academic centers, with community hospitals, to ensure that generalizability and that also that diversity in data.
And so, thank you for touching on all of these kind of different aspects of what's, going on, in our field and at AJOG MFM. And so I guess, just taking the 1,000-foot view, like, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges, still ahead right now, in publishing and writing and reviewing and study design? I mean, I know that's a big question, but.
I'm an optimist at heart, and I'm hopeful in general. And so what I think is on the horizon, And what I think is our biggest limitation now is we still use a lot of databases. And unfortunately, a lot of our databases are older. And unfortunately, a lot of our national databases have a lot of limitations, particularly in regard to the things that we now know are really important. Like, how are we characterizing people by race and ethnicity? Is that category a self-reported box? Are we expansive in sort of how we're allowing people to identify? And because a lot of our data that we currently use in databases are, before this time, before this racial reckoning, before us really being thoughtful about these topics, I think there's that significant limitation. Not that those databases should not be discounted and not that we can't learn from them. Certainly we can. But I guess my hope and what I envision is a future where we are better, and a future where we create a new standard, and a future where these databases are expansive in race characterization, in how people characterize ethnicity, and subsequently how we perform our statistical analysis and how we publish our data. And I think that's the biggie in moving forward. And what I'm also hoping for is, instead of sort of using these proxies like we discussed before, that we're bold and deliberate in what we're really studying and looking at those markers specifically. I also hope that as we move forward, that we're more inclusive of social determinants of health. Maybe those factors are going to be listed in our table 1. Maybe that will become the new standard, because we know that those things are truly impactful, and that socioeconomic status, no matter what proxy we use, is really not the end all be all and truly not the answer, especially when we think about maternal mortality and Black maternal health. So that's my hope for the future, is that as all of our journals are moving into this equity space, that what follows next is how we design our studies in the first place.
And I think the thing that I just really took away from that as well was to, just in the same way that we may look at older studies and say, we don't use this as much because the statistical methodology back then wasn't as good. I think it's also to say, maybe in some of these older studies from these databases, as you mentioned, that, we have to look at them with a different lens in terms of how they, are talking about diversity and equity, and say that, that lens isn't the same as what we would do now, and that we can improve on that, as you suggested, and to, just take that, from some of the major studies that we all use day to day, and really think about that critically.
Exactly. And that's my goal. So I'm glad that you took that away from that, Matt. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's so exciting that, at the end of the day, we look at medical publications to kind of gather information to direct our care, but sometimes the patient sitting in front of us doesn't always reflect what we can find in the literature. And I think some of this, that we're being more expansive, that we're including more language, that we're looking in more detail, may give us better insight, so that the person in front of me is really going to get the impact of somebody else's experience.
And that's how we learn from one another, and that's how we become better as a field. So that's my dream and hope for MFMs across the globe. And definitely at AJOG MFM, that's really at the core of our principles and how we are moving in regards to the type of papers that we're hoping to attract and that we're looking to publish.
And then I think really, one of the last questions, when we're thinking about this is, how, if at all, does, kind of the blinding process in reviews and between, writers and reviewers and editors, kind of play into this, or does it play into this at all?
I think we're going to have to look at that, right? I think we need the data to figure out, are we accomplishing what we truly intended? I think in general, we have great intentions as human beings and as physicians. And I think the double-blinded process is amazing. I think it definitely eliminates many barriers. And the hope is that it improves, the diversity in our authors, the diversity and location of where the data is coming from, that we have more minoritized authors and physicians that are publishing data, that we have more minoritized and people who are first authors or last authors or published authors in general. And I think that the double-blinded process is intended to create sort of equity in that way. And I'm looking forward to, we're going to need, I think, more data and years of experience of us looking back to see that it truly accomplished what we hope that it intended. One thing I think that's been on the table is sort of, should we triple blind? How much blinding can we do? And may it backfire? That's the other question. Should there be a lens where we're looking to make sure that our goals are truly being accomplished by this process. So I think, the answers to that are yet to come. I'm hopeful and optimistic that it will eventually evolve into creating more diversity and equity in that way. And so that's why at AJOG MFM, we've certainly been the leaders in that regard. And I think that it has lent us to put forth papers that are even better and even more powerful.
Yeah, I think that's so exciting that, we're going to see we're kind of in a process of a scientific experiment, if you will, of trying to see what can we do to be better, right? And part of that is the blinding. Going back to kind of these lower resource or patient, populations that may not have as much experience in the academic sector, are you also going to be providing opportunities for authors who may need assistance with learning formatting or making it so it appears with the same level, same quality of publication? Because the blinding, you may just only see, right, this one has better formatting than that one. Is there going to be any resources for those types of authors so that they will be on par and not be weeded out just because they didn't use the right font or they didn't use the right formatting or they didn't know how to read the guidelines?
I think that's an excellent question. And it really lends towards, are we really being equitable, right? If there's a difference between sort of equality and creating true equity. And I think that's sort of what your question is leaning into. And at Elsevier, there's actually a lot of resources. So if you go through the author instructions, it's quite long, but it's long because it's filled with so much really great resources. And there are some of those things that's available for review. It's particularly around language, because we also encourage publications that are not written or done in the United States. They're not necessarily initially written in English. And so those are not papers that we necessarily want to disregard. We encourage them and we want to see the data across the board. And so there's definitely resources that Elsevier has to help in a lot of that regard. And that's why I think our author instructions have such a girth to it, because it's filled with so much vital information. So I really encourage people to visit, especially if you're from an institution that may not have a very strong research background. I think that the author instructions really helps to guide you in regards to how and what, and then also send you to additional resources to help along the way.
That's great. I'm glad we have, that inclusion for our different varieties of backgrounds for our authors, as well as for reviewers, and even that the editorial board is being aware to make the publication process more transparent for different backgrounds of authors.
Absolutely.
And so I think that we're kind of coming up at the end of our time here, but I really just wanted to say, thank you so much, for your time and for, I think a lot of great, ideas and kind of call to action on a lot of this. And are there any kind of last points or last takeaways that you really want to highlight before we wrap up?
Yes, thank both of you for really bringing this to the forefront and for creating this platform for us to have this provocative discussion. And I've even come up actually with a few thoughts of my own of things that I should look at or be better at, or things that we can publish to sort of really help to lead in this lane. I think one thing as the equity, diversity, and inclusion editor that I really want to hone in on is sort of that mantra and that theme of always working to be better. We are at a junction now as a society where we really have to be intentional and we have to be deliberate, and we want to learn from the mistakes of our past. And I think as we are sort of really focusing on how to eliminate health disparities and how to practice in an equitable healthcare system, we as physicians are going to have to figure out how do we become better people and better physicians. And I think that's going to take some self-directed learning, and we're all accustomed to that, right? We've all been in school for 500 million years. And I think, doctor means teacher. That's ultimately who we are. But that means that we also have to teach ourselves. And the way how we do that is by learning and understanding history. Like the 1619 Project, I think, is a great way to start. It's a great book. There's also a TV series that's coming out in regards to that as well. But I highlight some of these things because in order for us to really use language and understand the implications for a lot of this work that's around diversity, equity, inclusion, I think we have to really make sure that we, as an author, we as a a reviewer, me as a researcher, truly understand the plight, the obstacles, the historical context around many of these things. And the only way we can do that is if we continue to teach ourselves and we continue to evolve and we continue to be expansive. So I encourage some of that like homework to like create these journal clubs, build your equity curriculums within your institution, and read about these really tough topics. And that's how we're truly going to evolve and elevate our collective consciousness in general and overall as a society for maternal fetal medicine specialists and AJOG MFM. So thank you both for this opportunity to really highlight some of these factors that I think are really important and how I think that we're going to move forward in the publications of equity, diversity, and inclusion at AJOG MFM.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennett, for your time and for allowing us to ask you all these difficult questions and really have this discussion. So we really appreciate all that you've brought to the table today.
Thank you both so much.
Yes, thank you so much.